Television was considered the practical babysitter in the 1970s and 1980s. The Saturday morning and weekday afternoon school superhero cartoons. Later, the prime-time science fiction, dramas, and comedies from the 1970s through 1990s that kept us entertained and hooked us as adults. These are my all-time favorites I repeatedly watched. The Super Friends franchise. As a young child during the late 1970s, this was my Saturday morning favorite. More especially Challenge of the Super Friends. Challenge not only introduced me to a full line of the comic book DC superheroes, but the DC set of villains as well. Again, I only picked up on Challenge of the Super Friends upon the series' last 2 episodes. It was disturbing as a child watching the episode, Rest in Peace, where seemingly the superheroes were being killed off by the Legion of Doom. It was nearly traumatizing, but in the end the superheroes, strangely enough, returned. The Super Friends are not my only superheroes cartoon memories as a child. I also was a fan of Spider-Man and his amazing friends. Spider-Man introduced me to Marvel comics and characters, but I never became a fan of Marvel. I preferred the DC superheroes. The funny thing about cartoons as a child, you think they were real. Today you know how animation is created, either by a team of artists or CGI. But as a child you thought the animation and voices were as real as you were. When your parents purchased your favorite costumes for Halloween. As much as you loved the cartoon superheroes, you also believed you became the superhero too. It was safer with superhero toys that your parents purchased for you to play with rather than attempt to fly or perform stunts the characters did. Well, who didn't actually try jumping off a couch or bed on a pillows pretending to be Superman? Laugh out loud. Transformers G1. I was a September 1984 debut fan. I think it aired on weekday afternoons after I got home from school. I was hooked from episode 1 to the theatrical movie to the 3-part episode, The Rebirth, and then it was unfortunately done. It would return in a few other animated incarnations. G1 would remain the fan favorite and my favorite. There was a season 3 episode called Dark Awakening. It had an ending promo I recall saying, "Is this really the end of Optimus Prime?" Find out in tomorrow's exciting episode the return of Optimus Prime. They had apparently aired the episode before without that added promo. I remember the 5-part 5 Faces of Darkness, which picked up after where the movie left off. But only after a few episodes I was turned off by the new Autobot characters. Not until my adult years did I finish watching the 3rd season. The movie's release in summer of 1986 was very disturbing. A bit of foul language, and most of the Autobots killed off in very violent scenes. My young brother was finishing last month at summer camp, in its closing days. When he returned home, my father said, "Take your brother to see the movie." So, it would be the only time ever I saw a film twice in the theater. Years later, as an adult, when the internet started to show production notes about filming, I learned the 1986 Transformers movie was more about killing off the original toy line to make room for new toys. Even voice actor Peter Cullen, the voice of Optimus Prime, said no one knew Prime's popularity till he was killed off. That's when it was decided to bring him back in both episodes Dark Awakening and the return of Optimus Prime in the Season 2 finale. I also discovered Transformers toys in Sears' Christmas catalog. I just recently researched a page on the internet to find the price of what my parents paid for Optimus Prime, $24.95. I don't think I actually purchased him based on being a Transformers fan, but he was a big rig tractor trailer. I think my interest had to be associated with the song and film Convoy. That also is strange to discover when searching for convoy-related items on eBay. The word convoy was associated with Transformers. I would find out that Convoy was the name of Optimus Prime as a truck in the Japanese toy release. In the stores, Transformers were kind of high in price, ranging $20 to almost $60. Forget the Decepticons. They were in the $50 to $60 range. I was allowed to pick up an Autobot named Trailblazer for $14.95. He was only seen in the 1st season, so I doubt his toy sold very well. But I still have my original Optimus Prime purchased from the Sears Christmas catalog. Today, I'm missing the full trailer, his gun and hands, but I do still have his little companion roller. I think he kind of reminds me of the zombie-looking Optimus Prime in the episode Dark Awakening. My wife and I both enjoyed watching the Prime animated series, which featured the return of voice actor Peter Cullen. Despite, my wife wasn't a fan of toys or cartoons. The Michael Bay films may have seemed interesting, and thank God Peter Cullen was again Prime's voice. I was disappointed with the CGI look of all the Transformers. They looked like what I would disturbingly call a starving artist sculpture. Honestly, they look like a vehicle put together from a junkyard by someone who doesn't know anything about car mechanics. Plus, the story created its own origin stories for the Transformers I really disliked. That's so similar to comics. That's why I remain a cartoon fan of G1. G.I. Joe, a real American hero. There were a lot of news reporting situations involving the military, soldiers, guns, fighting, etc. during the 1970s and 1980s. As children, you vaguely thought, I'll get the bad guys and shoot them and be the hero. You would even hear stories from your own family members who serve in actual war, as did my father in Vietnam. Well, comic book writers and superhero animators answered the call to children to fight in their own fictitious wars between American troops and bad guys with G.I. Joe. The toy lineup was really pushed during the mid-1980s, but they were very expensive. Ironically, the antagonists or bad guys, Cobra, their toy vehicles were 1/4 to half the expense of G.I. Joe vehicles. I can recall seeing the G.I. Joe USS Flag aircraft carrier in a toy store with the price tag at $500. My mother exclaimed not about the price, but where would you put that? Being 6 to 7 feet in length. Even today in YouTube channels talking about toys from the past, show the aircraft carrier was meant to be authentic enough to hold actual large-size aircraft and vehicles. It took almost 1/4 of a child's bedroom for space. But Dad did buy me the G.I. Joe Sky Striker jet, which was quite large in size. I didn't realize there was an animated series until sometime after the 3-week-long 3 sets of miniseries had already debuted. There were so many episodes I really don't recall, which was my first. But related to the toys, the animated series had awesome characters, stories which were similar to DC superheroes, and no one actually died. The bad guys escaped after their plans were foiled, which of course gives the reason for so many episodes. When Transformers announced a movie theatrical release, actually continuing on its popular animated series, it was curious G.I. Joe the movie was released to VHS tape instead. Did I miss the theatrical release? Not until years later did I learn and come to understand its history and situation of why it was not released to theaters. It was because the killing of Transformers Optimus Prime really bothered kids and parents. They instead placed G.I. Joe, the movie, straight to VHS tape because G.I. Joe character would have another apparent or alleged death. But its movie, even on VHS, was fantastic, giving Cobra an origin story where a little later, as an adult, I researched the comic book of G.I. Joe, vaguely learned some things that were disturbingly boring. Where the movie gave Cobra a great origin story, the comic book history claimed he was originally a car salesman. The comics also gave both G.I. Joe and Transformers characters crossover stories. I could never really follow comic books. They were confusing, not as much fun to look at as animated episodes or movies. I think this is where my learning disability also definitely applied. Remembering my brain refused to conjure images to understand a fictional book. A comic book image didn't work with me. I also didn't understand why comics, animated episodes, and movies did not follow the same path or stories 100%. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Similar to G.I. Joe, I didn't even know an animated series existed because the toys were first to be marketed. One Christmas, when Dad received a large bonus, he usually did, he surrounded the tree with so many gifts the tree nearly disappeared. On top of the wall of some wrap boxes were a few unwrapped toys. One was of a toy male sitting on a green lion or cat. It was He-Man on top of Battle Cat. I had no idea who this was. But unlike G.I. Joe or Transformers, the He-Man collection of toys wasn't expensive. I was able to collect several of both heroes and villains in the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe collection, including Castle Grayskull. I have no idea when I started watching He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon series, but just like every other, I was hooked. The fortunate thing about cartoons in the 1980s, there were so many you never realized one was ending because it was there always another new one. The only turnoff for me, as an avid young fan of He-Man, was Prince Adam. He at times was bumbling and clumsy. He was meant to throw off any possible connection between him and He-Man being the same person. Similar to Clark Kent/Superman, it would be plain stupid and unreal not to see they were the same person. As a fan of either, I believe it drove us fans crazy. The revealing was never allowed. While Superman's identity was eventually revealed, He-Man, no way. Thundercats. Weekends for us kids are the vacation from school, as were most adults, but where our parents would have to drag us out of bed on weekday mornings for school. We got up at 6 to 8 a.m. for our Saturday morning superheroes. However, in middle school, junior high, when we returned home at 3 to 4 p.m., it was again time for afternoon superhero cartoons. Transformers and G.I. Joe series episodes were seemingly ending. Like I said before the 1980s, you never realized one would be ending and another would quickly be added to take its place. One of the replacements was Thundercats, and I was also an Episode 1 fan. I also recall hearing a Broadway play called Cats and seeing TV promos for it. They very much looked like the live-action version of the animated Thundercats. I was always strongly curious if the Thundercats took inspiration from the Broadway play, but I never found any mention to connect or debunk my belief. I don't remember the cost of each toy line, but I was able to collect the vehicles more than the characters. I did collect Lion-O, Mum-Ra, and the Thunder Tank. But like most toys, oh my god was I stupid. I took them apart to see what they looked like inside, or that we saw screws, and with our father's tools, just foolishly took them apart. I also remember playing with Lion-O versus Mum-Ra, as if they were flying a superhero versus villain. Dallas, 1978 to 1991. My parents said they had been watching this since its 1978 debut. I vaguely recall the over-promoted news involving the Who Shot JR third season finale. But I didn't start watching until another over-promoted finale involving the return of a dead and buried Bobby Ewing. Yes, Dallas was not only a mega hit nationwide as well as worldwide obsession, especially with the creation of the cliffhanger season finales. It was a must-watch TV show for our family as well. My first broadcast episode was the season 10 season premiere, Return to Camelot, which explained how Bobby returned from the dead. His wife Pam had dreamed the entire 9th season. But just like my parents, I was also hooked on it too. Though it only lasted 4 more years, it seemed like 20. The show was described as a dysfunctional wealthy Texas family. Well, not too long after I started, I mentioned to my mother how I could relate each character of Dallas to our family and the company we worked for in Philadelphia. She fully agreed. She actually said, take away the oil, the ranch, and wealth, and that's us. Again, cable TV channels promoted commercial videotapes for sale in the early to mid-1990s. Different from Columbia Home Videos, which only had scattered episodes instead of full seasons, the company that released Dallas onto VHS had full season episodes. I purchased the first 2 seasons until cable channels that began showing classic television reruns started showing Dallas. I was only 16 years old when a promoted TV movie said it would show how it all began, called Dallas: The Early Years. It was the ultimate prequel film. Many of the series' elder characters seen in their younger years, including young Digger Barnes, who was constantly labeled a drunk. You could definitely attach alcoholic to him instead. My mother was right to compare Dallas to our own family, especially with Digger Barnes' alcoholism. Yes, I never mentioned the lead character and protagonist J.R. Ewing. Do I really need to? But he was something that helped inspire me, not to be the husband he was. MASH, 1972 to 1983. I never got to watch the original broadcast since I was very young, of course. Heck, I was only 11 3/4 years old when the final episode aired on February 28th, 1983. I was only able to watch the first minute, having begun at 9 p.m. on a school night. The final episode's title, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, displayed on the screen with Hawkeye sitting outside on a bench with a robe on. I thought this was about a hospital during a war. The television I was watching was in my parents' bedroom. My father sat on the bed and began watching when he said, go to bed. It was a Monday, a school night, so I didn't have a choice. As if it were a weekend, I probably would have been able to watch it in its entirety. It wasn't until the early 1990s when cable television channels began showing reruns of classic shows from the 1950s through 1980s. But among the new channels were also commercials that promoted MASH VHS tape release by Columbia Home Video. I was able to purchase the newly released VHS tapes. However, they were not the entire full season episodes. But I did get to see the original full version pilot episode. I then learned of the original 1970 film and picked up that from a video rental store. Again, like I mentioned before, new cable channels specifically created for classic TV shows begin popping up through the cable guide list. I was finally able to watch MASH in full season. In 1993, while I was a very brief student of a business school, a typing teacher, while talking to her on a vague personal level, I asked if she heard of or remembered MASH. And why would I ask a business school teacher that? Maybe it was because I began reciting the jokes I learned from MASH for the first time. She said she had a VCR taping of the final episode from the original broadcast. I was overjoyed, and she let me borrow it for my first ever view of the full episode. With cable channels and eventual video releases of the full seasons, I became a repeated viewer, watcher, big fan of MASH. Today, they would call us a new generation of fans. I watched the episodes repeatedly, so much I'd remember the constant jokes and actually use them to lighten up busy and frustrating days in the restaurant business. Star Trek: The Next Generation, 1987 to 1994. Though I'd seen a few of the original series episodes on cable channel classic TV reruns, I honestly found its stories boring. Though the characters were fun to watch, the plots were vague. The film releases were, of course, far better than the series episodes. Much stronger plots, stories, action, and of course the characters. I had no idea or heard of the sequel series The Next Generation at all, probably because I was finishing up high school finals. While I was surfing channels, I caught a TNG episode called Shades of Grey, the second season finale. I didn't even realize it was what's called or considered a clip episode. The plot would include several scenes, characters, and stories from the first two seasons. For some reason, clip episodes are not popular, but I liked the episode. It helped grab my attention as a new Star Trek fan for life, through to its final episode and sequel series Deep Space Nine, Voyager and Discovery. I was a fan of each TNG character, but one I could really relate to, especially in age and becoming a part of the crew, was Wesley Crusher, played by Will Wheaton. I definitely paid more attention to him as he worked his way to be accepted as a valued bridge staff and care for the crew and ship. The particular episode that really affected me the most involving Wesley was Season 3 episode Menage a Troy. He was getting ready to transfer to another ship to be taken back to Earth to begin Starfleet Academy. But he instead was able to help secure the return of three characters back to the Enterprise. Captain Picard, who was in competition of who was arguably the best captain between him and former Captain Kirk of the original series, realized Wesley will not only be an up-and-coming bridge staff, but he would put the crew and ship before himself. Picard promoted him to full ensign. I often comment that no one ever saw potential in me till I was later in age. Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry said in interviews has often been noted to say Star Trek was and is a positive outlook of our future. That's why I enjoy Star Trek over most any other science fiction show. Stargate SG-1, 1997 to 2007. I remember watching the original in the theater and gave it a high rating as really good. I didn't even know there was a sequel series till it was very much over after a 10-season run. It was probably when the sequel series Stargate Atlantis and Universe were promoted that I discovered SG-1. I actually found the Atlantis and Universe sequel series not as good and watched them only one time. After I watched the first episode of SG-1 and realized it was a continuation 1 year later after the film, according to production, the filmmaker claims it had nothing to do with the television series. I still find that hard to believe. The cast, like my other favorite TV shows, were fantastically casted actors, characters, plots, and stories grab your attention. I think like Star Trek, I felt it had a close association to realism. While Star Trek had a positive outlook of the future, the antagonist characters, the go-ho-hold, which seemed to be an extended opposite abbreviation of the word God. And this rightly so. since lead archaeologist character Daniel Jackson's research would explain how each the Goho hold was related in fact were supposed to be our actual gods of ancient Earth. This concept gave the show, in my opinion, a Star Trek concept of believability. The West Wing, 1999 to 2006. I did not pick up on this until its ending 7th season, even yet only one episode. I vaguely recall watching an apparent live broadcast called The Debate, which was former MASH star Alan Alda and former NYPD Blue star Jimmy Smits competing for the next presidency. Again, cable TV channel reruns in the mid-2000s, I discovered this fantastically written, casted actors, sarcastic characters, and very accurately depicted life and working in the White House. I was so grabbed by this drama. I couldn't stop watching it even after I finished its entire 7-season run. I'm not lying or exaggerating. I watched this show 10 times in a row and could continue to rewatch it. I often remember and use West Wing episodes, characters, and moments, and can relate to real-life matters involving our government. If I'm not mistaken, former President Bill Clinton endorsed this show on accuracy. I remember actor Martin Sheen, whose major movie career involved 2 presidential movies. He portrayed a White House chief of staff with Michael Douglas in The American President, and the tragic life of President John F. Kennedy in a made-for-TV movie. He was a concrete choice as President Bartlett. As with the same following I had with teenage Wesley Crusher on Star Trek TNG, I watched Bartlett's young daughter Zoe. I don't mean her looks, but her character's kind of turbulent storylines and disturbing kidnapping season finale. I think the show should have been able to continue with the new president, Matt Santos.